I watched our carriers vanish from my tables, one column at a time. My superiors said the losses would slow the enemy, but the numbers refused to wait. Each report showed ships returning faster than Doctrine allowed me to believe. I wrote what I saw and learned how heavy silence can be. By late 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a strategic environment that differed sharply from the assumptions under which it had entered the war. The decisive carrier battle anticipated by pre-war doctrine had not occurred as planned. Instead, a sequence of engagements, Coral Sea in May, Midway in June, and the prolonged struggle around Guadalcanal beginning in August had imposed sustained losses on Japan's carrier force. The operational situation in the Pacific was no longer defined by a single climactic encounter, but by an extended campaign that demanded continuous replacement of ships, aircraft, and trained crews. In Tokyo, within the offices of the Naval General Staff, officers worked to compile and interpret reports arriving from Combined Fleet Headquarters and forward areas. Among them was Commander Hiroshi Tanaka, a mid-ranking staff officer assigned to operational analysis. Tanaka was not a public figure, nor a senior decision-maker. His responsibilities were routine and administrative, reviewing after-action summaries, comparing fleet strength tables, and updating estimates of enemy capabilities. His role reflected the institutional processes by which the Navy attempted to understand the evolving balance of forces. Tanaka's workday began early. He arrived at his desk to find stacks of typed reports, many bearing the markings of hurried transmission. Loss lists from the Solomon Islands arrived alongside intelligence summaries derived from radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. These documents were consolidated into internal memoranda that circulated among senior planners. The task required precision rather than interpretation. Conclusions were expected to align with established assumptions unless explicitly directed otherwise. By the autumn of 1942, the operational problem confronting the Navy was becoming evident. Carrier air groups had suffered heavy attrition during repeated engagements around Guadalcanal. Pilots were lost faster than training programs could replace them, and maintenance facilities in forward areas struggled to keep aircraft operational. The carriers themselves, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and others, required periodic withdrawal for repair. Each absence reduced the fleet's immediate striking power. Doctrine held that the United States would face similar constraints. Japanese pre-war estimates assumed that American carrier construction would proceed slowly and that the loss of several fleet carriers would impose a significant operational pause. These assumptions were rooted in assessments of shipyard capacity, training pipelines, and peacetime naval budgets. Tanaka had studied these estimates during his earlier postings and had no reason initially to question their validity. As reports accumulated, however, certain inconsistencies emerged. Tanaka noted that American carrier formations continued to appear in operational areas with little interruption. Following the losses at Midway, U.S. carriers were again encountered in the Solomons within months. Individual ship identifications were often uncertain, but the frequency of sightings suggested a level of availability that conflicted with Japanese expectations. In September 1942, Tanaka received a summary of aerial reconnaissance conducted from Rabaul. The report listed multiple carrier-sized vessels operating east of the Solomon Islands. While the exact number could not be confirmed, the presence itself was noteworthy. Tanaka compared this information with earlier estimates and annotated his working tables accordingly. The adjustments were minor, framed as provisional, and accompanied by notes emphasizing uncertainty. Within the Naval General Staff, such discrepancies were not unusual. Intelligence assessments often required revision as new information emerged. Yet Tanaka observed that the pattern was recurring. Loss reports from American sources, when intercepted or inferred, did not correlate with a reduction in enemy operational tempo. Instead, U.S. task forces appeared capable of sustained presence even after engagements that Japanese planners believed would impose recovery periods. The institutional response to these observations was measured. Senior officers attributed the apparent resilience to temporary concentration of forces or the rotation of damaged units. The prevailing view held that American naval power remained finite and that continued pressure would exhaust it. Tanaka's memoranda reflected this consensus, though he continued to annotate margins with questions regarding replacement rates and shipyard throughput. At the same time, Japanese carrier operations were increasingly constrained. Fuel shortages limited training sorties, and the loss of experienced aircrew reduced combat effectiveness. Tanaka reviewed personnel reports indicating that replacement pilots arrived with fewer flight hours than their predecessors. These reports were factual and unadorned, but their implications were clear. Qualitative decline accompanied quantitative loss. In October, Tanaka attended a routine briefing where a senior planner summarized the current carrier balance. The presentation relied on established tables that projected American carrier strength months into the future. According to these projections, American carrier losses should have reduced their available carriers to a minimal number. Tanaka followed the briefing closely, noting that recent reconnaissance reports were not incorporated into the figures presented. After the meeting, Tanaka returned to his desk and resumed his comparative analysis. He placed side by side the doctrinal projections and the latest operational reports. The discrepancies were small when viewed individually, but collectively they suggested a trend. American carriers were being replaced or returned to service more rapidly than anticipated. The mechanisms behind this capability were not fully understood within the staff, and available intelligence on U.S. industrial capacity was limited. Tanaka drafted a brief internal note highlighting the need to review assumptions regarding enemy replacement rates. The language was cautious, emphasizing the preliminary nature of the observation. He avoided drawing conclusions, instead recommending further data collection. The note was circulated through routine channels and filed without immediate comment. The operational situation in the South Pacific continued to evolve. Naval engagements around Guadalcanal persisted into November, with both sides committing significant resources. Japanese forces achieved tactical successes at times, but these did not translate to sustained strategic advantage. Carrier availability remained a limiting factor, and the Navy increasingly relied on land-based air power to compensate. As autumn turned to winter, Tanaka's workload increased. Reports arrived detailing additional American carrier activity, including sightings of vessels not previously encountered. Identification remained uncertain, but the frequency suggested an expanding pool rather than a diminishing one. Tanaka updated his tables once more, marking entries with question marks where certainty lacked. The growing body of data did not yet compel a revision of official doctrine. Within the Naval General Staff, established assumptions carried institutional weight, reinforced by years of planning and training. Tanaka's role did not permit him to challenge these assumptions directly. His responsibility was to ensure that information was accurately recorded and made available for those empowered to decide. By December 1942, the operational problem had taken on a clearer shape. Japanese carrier losses were real and difficult to replace. American carrier presence, by contrast, showed no corresponding decline. The contrast was noted in staff discussions, often attributed to temporary factors or intelligence errors. Tanaka continued his routine work, aware that the data he compiled might later assume greater significance. The period closed without a definitive resolution. The Navy remained engaged in active operations, and immediate tactical concerns dominated planning. The question of American replacement capacity lingered in the background, unresolved but increasingly relevant. Tanaka filed his latest reports and prepared for the next cycle of analysis, as the war at sea continued without pause. By the opening months of 1943, the operational strain on the Imperial Japanese Navy had become systemic rather than episodic. The Guadalcanal campaign had concluded unfavorably, and with its end came a clearer accounting of losses sustained over the preceding half-year. Carrier air groups were depleted, several fleet carriers required extended repair, and the pool of experienced aviators had been significantly reduced. These conditions framed the environment in which staff officers in Tokyo continued their assessments. Commander Hiroshi Tanaka's responsibilities expanded as the flow of information intensified. The withdrawal from Guadalcanal generated a surge of after-action reports, maintenance summaries, and personnel returns. Tanaka and his colleagues were tasked with consolidating these materials into coherent assessments of fleet readiness. The process was procedural, but the underlying figures conveyed an unmistakable message of attrition. Aircraft loss reports showed a steady decline in operational strength. Replacement aircraft arrived slowly, often lacking spare parts, and were distributed among units already stretched thin. Pilot rosters reflected increasing reliance on newly trained personnel with limited combat experience. Tanaka recorded these details methodically, entering them into standardized forms that tracked readiness over time. At the same time, intelligence concerning American naval activity continued to challenge pre-war assumptions. Radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports indicated the presence of U.S. carrier task groups in multiple theaters. Operations in the Central and Southern Pacific appeared to proceed concurrently, suggesting a level of force availability that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Tanaka compared these observations against doctrinal expectations that American carrier losses would force a sequential, rather than simultaneous, deployment pattern. In January 1943, a staff estimate circulated that projected American carrier strength for the coming summer. The document assumed limited replacement capacity and anticipated a gradual decline in enemy operational tempo. Tanaka reviewed the estimate and cross-referenced it with recent sightings and engagement reports. The figures did not align. American carriers were appearing in areas where, according to projections, none should have been available. Tanaka prepared a supplementary memorandum noting the discrepancy. The language remained conservative. He avoided asserting error and instead framed his observations as indicators of potential variance in enemy replacement timelines. The memorandum suggested that American ship repair and construction capabilities might be operating at higher levels than previously assessed. It recommended further investigation into industrial output and training throughput. The response to this memorandum was muted. Within the Naval General Staff, competing priorities dominated attention. Submarine warfare, convoy protection, and the defense of newly threatened island chains demanded immediate planning. Strategic estimates concerning long-term enemy capacity were acknowledged but deferred. Tanaka's memorandum was logged and archived, joining a growing collection of similar notes. Operational failures continued to accumulate. In February, Japanese carrier-based air units conducted limited operations, constrained by fuel shortages and maintenance delays. Training programs were curtailed to conserve resources, further slowing the development of replacement pilots. Tanaka reviewed training schedules and noted reductions in flight hours compared to pre-war standards. These reductions were not presented as failures, but as necessary adjustments to wartime conditions. Meanwhile, reports from the Central Pacific indicated renewed American activity. The identification of specific carrier hulls remained uncertain, but the operational pattern suggested rotation rather than scarcity. Damaged American carriers appeared to withdraw briefly before reappearing in subsequent operations. Tanaka annotated these cycles, comparing them to Japanese repair timelines, which were measured in months rather than weeks. In March 1943, Tanaka attended another internal briefing. The presentation focused on Japanese losses and emphasized the need for tactical efficiency to compensate for material shortfalls.
When American capabilities were discussed, the emphasis remained on eventual attrition through continued engagement. The assumption persisted that American industrial capacity, while substantial, was not limitless. Tanaka noted that the briefing relied on aggregate estimates rather than observed operational behavior. The distinction mattered. Aggregate estimates suggested a manageable opponent. Observed behavior suggested one capable of sustaining losses without operational pause. Tanaka recorded these impressions privately, aware that formal channels favored established analytical frameworks. As spring approached, the divergence between doctrine and reality became more pronounced. Japanese carrier operations were increasingly episodic, dictated by resource availability. American operations, by contrast, appeared continuous. Intelligence summaries reported the introduction of carrier aircraft types not previously encountered. These developments implied ongoing production and training pipelines functioning at scale. Tanaka requested access to additional intelligence materials related to American shipbuilding. The information available was fragmentary, derived from pre-war assessments and limited wartime observation. What emerged suggested American shipyards operated at a scale exceeding Japanese estimates. Construction timelines appeared shorter, and standardization allowed for parallel production. Tanaka incorporated these findings cautiously into his working notes. Repeated operational failures reinforced the emerging pattern. Japanese attempts to disrupt American carrier movements yielded limited results. Submarine attacks achieved occasional success, but did not produce sustained reduction in enemy carrier presence. Each reported American loss was followed within weeks or months by renewed activity. Tanaka tracked these intervals, noting their consistency. Within the staff, discussion increasingly reflected concern over Japanese limitations rather than American resilience. The focus shifted towards maximizing the effectiveness of remaining assets. Tanaka observed that this shift implicitly accepted the persistence of American carrier strength without explicitly acknowledging its source. The question of replacement capacity remained unaddressed at a doctrinal level. By May 1943, Tanaka's internal tables showed a widening gap. Japanese carrier availability declined steadily, while American availability appeared stable or increasing. The trend was unmistakable in numerical terms, though its interpretation remained constrained by institutional caution. Tanaka compiled a summary highlighting the trend over the preceding 12 months, presenting it as a statistical observation rather than an analytical conclusion. The summary circulated among mid-level planners, but did not prompt immediate revision of strategic assumptions. The prevailing belief held that American capacity would eventually reach its limits and that Japanese resolve and tactical innovation could offset material disadvantage. Tanaka understood the cultural and institutional roots of this belief, shaped by decades of naval tradition and experience. Despite the lack of formal acknowledgement, the tension between recorded data and official doctrine continued to grow. Tanaka's role placed him at the intersection of information and assumption. He documented what was observable while refraining from challenging what was believed. The accumulation of evidence, however, made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. As summer approached, preparations for future operations proceeded under unchanged strategic premises. Tanaka filed his latest assessments, aware that the data they contained diverged ever further from expectations set at the war's outset. The operational problem had escalated beyond isolated discrepancies into a persistent pattern, one that the institution had yet to reconcile.
By mid-1943, the disparity between expectation and observation had reached a point where it could no longer be treated as an analytical inconvenience. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer experiencing temporary imbalance, it was operating within a structural constraint. Carrier strength, aircrew experience, fuel availability, and repair capacity all moved in the same direction, downward. At the same time, the United States Navy continued to operate carriers across multiple axes of advance with consistency that defied earlier projections.
Commander Hiroshi Tanaka's position within the Naval General Staff placed him close to this contradiction, but without authority to resolve it. His work had shifted from routine compilation to comparative tracking. Rather than treating each report as discrete, he began organizing them into timelines. Loss dates were plotted against reappearances. Identified hulls were tracked across months. When uncertainty existed, he marked margins of error rather than single figures. The results were sobering. American carriers that Japanese doctrine assumed would require long repair periods returned to operations within surprisingly short intervals. Others appeared that did not match any known pre-war inventory. These could no longer be dismissed as misidentification alone. Even allowing for error, the margin was too large. In July 1943, Tanaka reviewed a consolidated intelligence packet concerning U.S. naval activity in the Central Pacific. The packet included aerial sightings, submarine contact reports, and intercepted radio traffic. When laid out sequentially, it suggested not merely replacement, but expansion. American task groups were larger, more flexible, and increasingly standardized in composition. This observation marked a turning point in Tanaka's internal process. He began to treat American replacement capacity not as an unknown variable, but as a driving factor in operational outcomes. The realization was not sudden or emotional. It emerged through accumulation. Numbers repeated themselves too consistently to be coincidence. Tanaka quietly altered how he prepared his assessments. Instead of beginning with doctrinal assumptions and fitting data into them, he reversed the order. He allowed observed operations to define provisional conclusions, which he then compared against doctrine. The results rarely aligned. One internal analysis focused on timelines. Japanese carrier losses at Midway had effectively removed 4 fleet carriers from immediate service. Replacement was not possible. Repair and reconstitution took years. In contrast, American losses at Midway, while significant, were followed by the appearance of new or refurbished carriers within months. By late 1943, American carrier presence exceeded pre-Midway levels. Tanaka prepared a working paper titled conservatively as A Review of Enemy Carrier Availability Patterns. It avoided policy language, it avoided recommendation, it did not argue. It simply documented sequences: loss, withdrawal, return. Where sources were uncertain, he cited margins of error. Where identification was ambiguous, he listed alternatives. This paper was not formally requested. That alone made its circulation sensitive. Within the Naval General Staff, analytical initiative outside assigned tasks was permitted but discouraged. Tanaka understood the risk. Challenging assumptions about American industrial and training capacity touched a foundational belief of pre-war planning. That belief held that Japanese qualitative superiority could offset Americans' quantitative advantage long enough to force negotiation. Replacement capacity undermined that logic. Tanaka chose a narrow distribution. He shared the paper with 2 colleagues at the same rank, both involved in logistics and operational planning. Their reactions were cautious but attentive. Neither disputed the figures. One remarked that similar patterns had been noticed in aircraft replacement rates. Another noted that American escort carriers were appearing with increasing frequency, expanding air coverage beyond fleet carriers alone. Encouraged by this confirmation, Tanaka revised the paper, adding a short annex on shipbuilding indicators. Drawing from fragmentary intelligence, he outlined American standardization practices, modular construction, parallel yard output, and accelerated training pipelines. None of this was speculative. It was drawn from pre-war commercial data and wartime observation. The revised paper was submitted upward through routine channels, attached to a broader operational summary. It did not challenge doctrine directly. It posed a question implicitly. If the enemy could replace carrier losses faster than anticipated, what did attrition mean? The response came not as a rebuttal, but as silence. Weeks passed without comment. Tanaka continued his regular duties. The absence of feedback itself conveyed meaning. The institution was not prepared to engage with the implication. Meanwhile, Operational developments reinforced the analysis. American carrier forces supported operations in the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. The scale of air operations exceeded Japanese expectations. Losses were absorbed without visible reduction in tempo. Tanaka logged the data, updating his tables once again. At this stage, the risk became personal, though not in a dramatic sense. Professional risk replaced physical danger. Persisting in analysis that diverged from accepted frameworks could stall advancement or reassign one to peripheral duties. Tanaka was aware of this. He had seen colleagues marginalized for less. He adjusted his approach. Rather than framing the issue as an American advantage, he reframed it as a Japanese constraint. His subsequent memoranda emphasized that Japanese losses were irreplaceable under current conditions. This was already accepted. What he left implicit was that American losses were replaceable, and rapidly so. In December 1943, Tanaka was asked to contribute to a planning document assessing future carrier operations. The document assumed limited American availability in early 1944. Tanaka reviewed the draft and inserted a footnote referencing recent operational patterns. The footnote suggested American carrier availability might exceed earlier estimates and recommended contingency planning. The footnote remained in the final draft, unchanged. That alone was significant. It represented the first formal acknowledgement, however subtle, that doctrinal assumptions might be incomplete. Tanaka did not view this as success. It was an adjustment, not a reversal, but it marked a shift from denial to accommodation. The turning point, such as it was, did not involve confrontation or decision. It involved acceptance at the margins. Planners began to hedge. Operational plans incorporated wider safety factors. Expectations of enemy exhaustion were softened, though not abandoned. For Tanaka, the realization had crystallized. The problem was not that Japanese officers could not believe the United States could replace carrier losses. It was that believing it required abandoning a framework that had guided decades of planning. Evidence alone did not compel change. Institutional logic resisted it. By the end of 1943, Tanaka continued his work with the same outward demeanor. Reports were filed, tables were updated, language remained cautious. But internally, the nature of the war at sea was clearer than before. Attrition favored the side that could replace faster, not merely fight better. The risk he carried was not of punishment, but of irrelevance, of knowing something that could not yet be acted upon. As preparations for the coming year advanced, Tanaka's analyses remained on file, present but understated, waiting for conditions that might force their implications into the open.
By early 1944, the strategic environment confronting the Imperial Japanese Navy had narrowed considerably. Operational choices were constrained by material scarcity, fuel rationing, and a diminishing pool of trained aircrew. Carrier operations, once the centerpiece of Japanese naval power, were now planned cautiously and executed intermittently. Against this backdrop, the implications of American replacement capacity moved from analytical concern to operational consequence. Commander Hiroshi Tanaka's work took on a different character. His assessments were no longer abstract exercises in comparison, but inputs into plans shaped by shortage. The Naval General Staff no longer spoke confidently of exhausting the enemy. Instead, it spoke of delaying action, selective engagement, and preservation of remaining assets. The language had shifted, even if doctrine had not been formally revised. In February 1944, preparations began for anticipated American operations in the Central Pacific. Intelligence indicated that U.S. forces were assembling carrier task groups of unprecedented size. Tanaka reviewed the compiled estimates. The projected number of American carriers exceeded any pre-war Japanese planning scenario. Escort carriers, once considered secondary, now appeared in large numbers, extending air coverage and absorbing losses that would previously have fallen on fleet carriers. Tanaka's earlier analyses were quietly consulted. A senior planner requested his latest tables on American carrier availability, not for circulation, but for internal reference. This request did not include commentary, but it marked a shift. Data that had once been noted and set aside was now being actively sought. Operational plans reflected this change indirectly. Japanese planners no longer assumed that damaging a portion of the American carrier force would create an operational pause. Instead, plans emphasized inflicting losses disproportionate enough to alter tempo, even if temporarily. The threshold for success had risen, acknowledging implicitly that limited attrition would not suffice. The consequences of this realization were evident during discussions surrounding the defense of the Mariana Islands. These islands were strategically vital, and their loss would expose the Japanese home islands to direct air attack. Carrier forces were identified as essential to contesting American advances, yet the available carriers could not be risked lightly. Tanaka reviewed readiness reports that showed how narrow the margin had become. Mechanical reliability was uneven, air groups were under strength, fuel reserves limited sustained operations. In internal memoranda, Tanaka framed the issue as one of asymmetry. American planners could accept losses as part of a replacement cycle. Japanese planners could not. Each carrier lost represented a permanent reduction in capability. This asymmetry, once theoretical, was now operationally decisive. Pushback emerged, though rarely in explicit terms. Some senior officers continued to argue that American replacement capacity would eventually strain under extended operations. They cited logistical complexity, distance from home ports, and the cumulative effect of losses. These arguments were not without merit, but Tanaka's data suggested that such strain had not yet materialized at the scale required to alter outcomes. During a planning conference in April 1944, Tanaka observed how discussions navigated around the issue without naming it. Planners spoke of enemy persistence and unexpected continuity of operations. These phrases served as proxies for the underlying reality. Direct acknowledgement of American industrial superiority remained culturally and institutionally difficult. The stakes of this avoidance became clearer as American operations accelerated. Carrier raids struck targets across the Central Pacific with increasing frequency. Damage inflicted on American forces was often followed by rapid recovery. Japanese intelligence tracked these cycles with growing concern. Tanaka updated his tables, now extending them backward to 1942 and forward into projections for late 1944. The trend lines were unmistakable. In May, Tanaka was asked to review an operational plan that assumed a decisive engagement could significantly reduce American carrier strength. Tanaka reviewed the plan carefully. Its assumptions mirrored those of earlier years, though modified by caution. Tanaka prepared a marginal note suggesting that even substantial American losses might not prevent continued operations given observed replacement patterns. This note prompted discussion. A senior officer questioned the basis of the assertion. Tanaka presented his data without embellishment. He emphasized observed timelines rather than theoretical capacity. The discussion remained professional, but its tone revealed unease. Acknowledging the implication meant accepting that decisive engagement might not produce decisive results. The plan was revised modestly. Objectives were adjusted to prioritize inflicting damage on air groups rather than hulls, on the assumption that trained personnel might be harder to replace. This adjustment reflected a narrowing of strategic options. It also reflected the influence of data-driven assessment, even if reluctantly applied. As summer approached, preparations intensified for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese leadership committed remaining carrier strength to a large-scale engagement, driven by the strategic necessity of contesting American advances. Tanaka reviewed the readiness reports with concern. He was aware that the engagement represented not only a tactical gamble, but a test of assumptions about attrition and replacement.
The outcome of the battle confirmed his analysis. Japanese carrier air power was effectively destroyed as an operational force. American losses, though not negligible, were absorbed. Carriers damaged in the engagement returned to service. New carriers joined the fleet. The operational balance shifted decisively. In the aftermath, Tanaka's earlier analyses were no longer peripheral. They aligned with observed outcomes in a way that could not be ignored. Staff discussions referenced replacement disparity more openly, though still without formal doctrinal revision. The institution adapted in practice while remaining conservative in language. The stakes for Tanaka were subtle. He was not promoted, nor was he reassigned. His role remained analytical. However, his assessments were now requested more frequently, particularly those dealing with long-term trends rather than immediate operations. The risk he had carried of being dismissed or sidelined did not materialize. Instead, his work became part of a broader, if understated, recalibration. By late 1944, the stakes had reached their peak. Japanese carrier aviation, once the symbol of naval power, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. American carrier forces operated with near impunity. The disparity Tanaka had documented years earlier now defined the operational reality. Yet, even at this stage, institutional acknowledgement remained measured. The narrative emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and the difficulty of circumstances rather than systemic imbalance. Tanaka understood this framing as a means of preserving cohesion and morale. He did not challenge it. His focus remained on documentation. Losses were recorded, timelines were updated, replacement rates were tracked, even as Japanese capacity to replace diminished further. The work continued, methodical and restrained. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were embodied in the shrinking options available to planners and the increasing inevitability of outcomes. Tanaka's role was not to alter these outcomes, but to ensure that the record reflected reality as accurately as possible. As the war entered its final phase, the quiet accumulation of evidence had done its work. The system had not transformed, but it had adapted enough to recognize the limits imposed by material imbalance. The realization that American carrier losses could be replaced rapidly and repeatedly had moved from disbelief to reluctant acceptance.
By the beginning of 1945, the operational picture confronting the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer in dispute within its professional ranks. Carrier aviation, once central to Japanese naval strategy, had been effectively neutralized as an independent force. What remained of the carrier fleet served limited roles, constrained by fuel shortages, lack of trained air crews, and overwhelming enemy superiority. The question that had once been cautiously avoided, how the United States could replace carrier losses so rapidly, had been answered in practice, if not formally in doctrine. Commander Hiroshi Tanaka continued his assignment within the Naval General Staff, now working in an environment shaped by defensive planning and damage limitation. His analyses shifted toward documenting the pace and scale of American operations rather than projecting Japanese counteraction. The tone of staff work had changed. Reports no longer assumed opportunities for decisive reversal. Instead, they focused on delaying actions, protecting remaining assets, and assessing the implications of further loss. Carrier activity in early 1945 demonstrated a level of sustained power that confirmed Tanaka's long-standing assessments. Task forces operated continuously off Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, supported by fleets that rotated carriers in and out of combat with minimal disruption. Damaged vessels withdrew, were repaired, and returned. New carriers appeared in operational zones without noticeable interruption to tempo. Escort carriers, now numerous, absorbed losses and extended coverage, reinforcing the resilience of the overall force. Tanaka compiled final comparative tables covering the period from 1941 through early 1945. These documents showed the cumulative effect of replacement capacity. Japanese carrier strength declined irreversibly after 1942. American strength, by contrast, increased year by year, even when accounting for losses. The figures required no commentary. Their meaning was evident. Institutionally, the Naval General Staff did not issue a formal declaration revising its pre-war assumptions. There was no document stating that earlier estimates of American industrial and training capacity had been incorrect. Such admissions were not customary, particularly in the final stages of the war. Instead, acknowledgement took the form of operational behavior. Planning assumptions were quietly adjusted. Expectations of enemy exhaustion were abandoned. Defensive preparations assumed continued American pressure without relief. Tanaka observed these changes with professional detachment. He understood that institutions adapt gradually, often without explicit self-critique. The shift he had documented over years, from disbelief to reluctant acceptance, had reached its conclusion not through argument but through experience. In the final months of the war, Tanaka's work focused increasingly on record-keeping. Loss reports, operational summaries, and intelligence assessments were compiled with care, even as resources dwindled. He understood the importance of preserving an accurate account for whatever post-war evaluation might follow. His role was not to assign blame or claim foresight, but to ensure that the documentary record reflected what had occurred. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Naval General Staff was dissolved. Records were seized, archived, or destroyed according to occupation directives. Tanaka, like many officers of his rank, was demobilized and returned to civilian life. He did not publish memoirs or seek public attention. His contributions remained embedded in files and memoranda, largely anonymous. In post-war analyses, conducted by both Japanese and Allied historians, the question of American industrial capacity became central to understanding the Pacific War. Shipbuilding output, standardized carrier designs, extensive training pipelines, and logistical depth explained outcomes that had once seemed improbable to Japanese planners. The replacement of carrier losses was not an improvisation, but the product of deliberate pre-war investment and wartime mobilization on a scale Japan could not match. Tanaka's wartime analyses anticipated many of these conclusions, though they remained internal and understated. He had not discovered American capacity, he had documented its effects. His work exemplified the role of staff officers whose contributions rarely shape headlines but inform understanding. They operate within constraints, recording what is observable even when it conflicts with expectation. The legacy of such work is quiet. There is no single moment of recognition, no formal acknowledgement of correctness. Instead, its value lies in accuracy and persistence. Tanaka's tables, memoranda, and annotations formed part of the institutional memory that, after the war, allowed historians and analysts to trace how assumptions diverged from reality. The story of Japanese officers confronting American carrier replacement capacity is not one of sudden revelation or dramatic confrontation. It is a story of gradual realization constrained by doctrine, culture, and circumstance. It is also a story of individuals like Tanaka, whose professional duty was to observe and record rather than to persuade or command. By the end of the war, disbelief had given way to understanding. The United States could replace carrier losses not through luck or anomaly, but through systems built to sustain prolonged conflict. For Japan, the recognition came too late to alter outcomes. For history, it provided a clear lesson in the relationship between industrial capacity and operational endurance.